Welcome, everybody, to the Dad's Doomsday Guide. Today, we wanted to get back to a topic that I've wanted to cover again ever since we had on Dr. Eben Alexander. That is near-death experiences. And today, we're very fortunate to have on a fantastic guest who has over 4 decades of experience in this field, Dr. Bruce Greyson. He is the Chester Carlson Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia. He was previously on the medical faculty at the University of Michigan and the University of Connecticut, where he was clinical chief of psychiatry. Dr. Greyson has consulted with the National Institutes of Health and addressed symposia on consciousness at the United Nations and at the Dalai Lama's compound in Dharamshala, India. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He has earned awards for his medical research and was elected to a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, the highest honor bestowed by that organization. He is also the author of the book, After, A Doctor Explores What Near-Death Experiences Reveal About Life and Beyond. And I just finished that actually yesterday, and it was an excellent book, Doctor. And the reason I kind of wanted to kind of go over some of your highlights is that something that for me, when I first started reading about NDEs, I never really took it as something that was studied seriously or by the scientific community. You always had this kind of idea, it's kind of this fantasy thing, and like people kind of like, oh yeah, well that's kind of an imaginative thing or something.
Right.
I guess, can you kind of talk about where you came from before you had they started this down the road of research, where you were kind of at religiously, did you believe in an afterlife? And then how did you kind of find a scientific way to approach this?
Sure. Thanks, Scott, for inviting me today. I'm glad to be talking to you.
Thank you.
I started out in a scientific household. My parents were scientists, and we had a materialistic view of the world. Just what you see is what you get. Mm-hmm. And we never had any spiritual or religious tradition to fall back on. So we just never considered those things. And when you die, that's the end of it. That's just the way life is. And I went through college and medical school with that mindset that the physical world was all there was, and that science, physical science, would explain everything to us eventually. And then when I started my psychiatric training, just a few weeks into it, I had an experience where I was asked to see a patient in the emergency room who had overdosed. And as it happened, I was eating my dinner in the cafeteria when my pager went off at my belt, and it shocked me. I was a new intern, didn't have the ropes down yet. And I dropped my fork and accidentally spilled some spaghetti sauce on my tie. Mm-hmm. Tried to wipe it off and couldn't. So I just put on a white lab coat and buttoned it over my chest so you couldn't see it. And then I went down to see the patient. And as it happened, she was completely unconscious. I could not arouse her no matter what I did. However, her roommate, who had brought her in, was waiting to speak to me down the hall in another room. So I went down the hall and talked to the roommate for about 15, 20 minutes to get her perspective on what was going on in the patient's life, what she might have taken for an overdose and so forth. So we talked for a while. It was a very hot Virginia evening at the end of the summer. And I started to sweat. This was back in the 70s when there wasn't air conditioning. So I opened my lab coat so I wouldn't sweat so much, inadvertently exposing the stain on the tie. When we finished talking, I stood up to say goodbye to her, realized that the stain was exposed, and quickly buttoned it up again so no one else in the ER staff would see that. And then said goodbye to the roommate, went back to talk to the patient, and she was still completely unconscious. So we arranged for her to be admitted to the intensive care unit overnight, and I would see her the following morning after she woke up. When I went there the following morning, she was awake, but just barely so. She was very, very drowsy. So I went into her room, and I started to introduce myself, and she stopped me and said, "I know who you are. I remember you from last night." That surprised me because as far as I could tell, she was completely unconscious. Mm-hmm. So I said that to her. I said, I'm surprised. I thought you were asleep when I saw you last night. And then she looked me in the eye and said, not in my room. I saw you talking to my roommate down the hall.
Wow.
Well, that just blew my mind. I couldn't imagine what she was talking about.
Yeah.
The only way that could have happened if she had left her body and followed me down the hall. And as far as I could tell, you are your body. How can you leave it? Didn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. She saw that I was confused and then started to tell me about the conversation I had with the roommate, all my questions, the roommate's answers, where we were sitting, and so forth. And then finally, she told me about the stain on my tie. And I just blew me away. I couldn't understand how she had gotten that information. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't there to deal with my confusion, but to deal with hers. So I had to kind of put it out of my mind and try to help focus with her on her suicidal thoughts and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I just kind of tried to put it out of my mind for a while. It was very unnerving because I just couldn't make any sense out of it, but I assumed there had to be some reasonable explanation. Somebody's playing a trick on me or something. So I just put it out of my mind for a few years. And then a few years later, one of my colleagues at the University of Virginia, Raymond Moody, wrote a book called Life After Life,
Mm-hmm.
in which he gave us the term near-death experience and described what they were like. And that was my first hint that this story the patient had told me was not just a one-time thing, but was part of a larger phenomenon that people were describing all over the world and for centuries.
Yeah, I was really surprised when you mentioned you knew Raymond Moody. I was like, oh, wow, because that was like one of the first books that I was kind of exposed to.
Yes.
Because like everybody, I don't know, I feel like everybody at some point in their life, you hit a point where you know, to me, the most important question is there anything after? Does consciousness survive death? And it kind of hit me at a younger age because you either know people who pass away or suffering. Something will trigger that. So I went to Raymond Moody, then Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And then recently I found the newer versions of kind of what you guys are doing. But I guess for people who, to set kind of the groundwork, consciousness, what is that to you? And I know you mentioned in your book, brain and mind. How do we categorize these two things when you talk about this connection that we have going on in the brain?
Right. Well, we don't really have a good definition for consciousness. It means many different things, like the word love. It can mean lots of different things to different people. But grossly speaking, consciousness is awareness, being aware of yourself and what's going on around you, having a subjective feeling that you understand what's happening. Now, our brain is this 3-pound mass of tissue inside our skulls that controls the body through nerves and hormones and so forth. And our mind is the word we use to describe that part of us that thinks and feels and has perceptions and forms memories and so forth. All the mental content of our life is what our mind does. Mm-hmm. And I was taught in medical school, and I think most people are taught that the mind is what the brain does, that all our thoughts and feelings and so forth are created by the brain. Now, of course, no one has any slightest idea how a chemical or electrical impulse in the brain can create a thought. But we just assume now someday we'll understand it. Mm-hmm. But things like near-death experiences and other experiences as well suggest that at times the mind and the brain are not the same thing. Now, it seems in everyday life like they are. Mm-hmm. When you get drunk, your mind gets fuzzy and you can't think very well. When you get hit on the head, you don't think very clearly. So it seems like the brain is creating all our thoughts and feelings. And when the brain is damaged, you don't think very clearly. Mm-hmm. But in near-death experiences, the brain is not functioning well, and sometimes it's not functioning at all. And yet people report that the NDE, or near-death experience, is the most vivid experience they've ever had. Their thinking is clearer and faster. Their perceptions are sharper. And we have no explanation for that.
Why is it so difficult to pinpoint? I mean, I guess the answer is kind of obvious. If it is something separate, if mind is something separate coming from somewhere else, then obviously you're not going to be able to pinpoint it. But that kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, hope that science kind of has that they're going to find where that's coming from in the brain, where it's manufactured in the brain.
Right.
Why has it been so difficult? Assuming maybe you could find it, why is it so difficult to kind of understand the brain, where that's coming from? Is it just our understanding is so poor about how these kind of things are going on?
Well, certainly our understanding is poor. Mm-hmm. We have no understanding, period. But it's sort of it's an assumption, it's a given by materialistic science that everything can be explained in terms of physiology in the body. Mm-hmm. So we assume that all our thoughts and feelings must come from the brain. But people have been trying to understand for centuries now how the brain can create thoughts and feelings. And we just hit a brick wall. We can't make any headway on that. Now, if you assume that the brain is here in the body and the mind is somewhere else, and that the function of the brain is to receive thoughts from the mind and translate them into something the body can use, that raises all sorts of questions like, how does the brain interact with the mind, and how does it perceive these thoughts? And we have no explanation for that either. Mm-hmm. So whether you think the mind is separate from the brain or created by the brain, we don't understand the process.
Yeah, it kind of blows my mind because, you think about if it's like, I think the term you use is almost like a reducing valve or like an antenna, and it picks up the mind. And it basically is using our brains as kind of a means to kind of interact with the world. Do you think science can really ever parse that out? Or is it going to be something just kind of always out of reach? I don't know. I feel like the materialist, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, the materialist point of view and kind of because you see it all the time with like, and it's kind of disheartening, is like the most vocal kind of the scientists out there, the people who are on the news, they kind of give off this sense that we kind of know everything we need to know about the physical nature of things, and it's frustrating to me because it's not, I don't care if it's a religious thing. I don't care if it's like, I just want to know the truth. And kind of like you mentioned in your book multiple times, you follow the evidence, even if it's something that kind of stretches your mind, it doesn't kind of conform to your present day thoughts. So I don't know. How do you feel this will evolve? Is it going to be kind of always elusive?
Yeah, I don't know. It does seem elusive right now, but I am a scientist. I have faith that someday science will be able to figure out how this happens. But it's beyond my understanding now, and I think no one who's living now can understand it. But it's a little arrogant for scientists to say we understand everything. I mean, we know that 95% of matter in the universe is dark matter, which we can't perceive. We know nothing about it. So how can you possibly say that we understand everything? I mean, people thought in the late 1800s that we knew everything there was to know about physics based on what Newton wrote hundreds of years earlier. And then within a couple of decades, we had the quantum revolution and the relativity revolution, which totally upended everything we thought we knew about physics. But I think we're on the same cusp of understanding now. We have no understanding of how the brain and the mind interact, but we may be on the verge of coming up with some new theory, some new model to understand this.
Really refreshing to see you and some others. It's funny because there's like a group of you at the University of Virginia who seem to be like kind of open to this stuff. Is it just existing there, or do you have a lot of colleagues? Do you know a lot of other people who just aren't in the limelight that also are doing this kind of research and kind of are taking up what you guys have shown as going, okay, there's something here we need to look at? Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of scientists all around the world who are studying this now. But the University of Virginia is the only place where we have a collection of them in one place. And in fact, I worked on my own for decades before I finally came to the University of Virginia in the 90s. But there have been some studies now done of surveys of scientists, one in Scotland, one in Belgium, one in Brazil, that show that half of all scientists believe that the mind and the brain are separate things. So this is not a minority opinion, really. It's something that's growing because we just don't understand how the brain can create mind.
For near-death experiences and the definition of them, I know there are a lot of people you can get kind of close to death. You can kind of be clinically dead, no heartbeat or brain activity. How do you, I guess, define it?
Well, we have some examples of people who are in cardiac arrest, whose hearts have stopped. They're not breathing. Their heart isn't beating. And we have some cases, very few though, where we have actually documented that the brain waves are flat. So there's no electrical activity in the brain. And yet these people have very vivid near-death experiences. However, they're virtually identical to the near-death experiences of people who don't seem to be that physiologically close to death. For example, people who fall off mountains or are in car accidents or drowning, in which we don't have any documentation that they actually had no brain activity and no heart activity, but they still thought they were close to death and had the same types of near-death experience.
Would you say that it's more convincing to you if someone has no heartbeat and no brain activity in terms of the kind of supporting the argument that the mind exists outside the brain? Or do you think it's like any interruption in that connection? Because I know you mentioned the woman who had a seizure and was finding herself outside of her body. So is it just any interruption that can kind of sever that for a second?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. If you're looking for evidence that the mind is separate from the brain, then you do want to focus on those cases where you have no electrical activity in the brain or no heartbeat, which means no blood flowing to the brain. But in terms of just, I'm a clinical psychiatrist. I work with helping people change their lives. And when I look at the effects that these near-death experiences have on people's lives, It doesn't matter how close you've come to death. If you have this type of profound spiritual experience, your life is forever changed after that.
Mm-hmm. And that was really interesting about the woman who was experiencing the seizure. She was like finding herself outside of her body. I mean, just from like a basic point of view, it's like that you shouldn't be able to do that. That's right. Like a big deal. So when scientists look at this, even she, I think, wanted to kind of dismiss it. But I mean, that's something to be researched, regardless of whether or not you think there's like an entity after, or like you're finding yourself outside of your body, and it's happening over and over again with, details that can be confirmed. Like, how is the response to that from like other scientists, even if you don't believe, like, they don't think that's a big deal, or they try to like use a different excuse, or?
Well, they usually try to find some other explanation, such as it was all just imagined, you didn't really leave your body. And if they claim to see things accurately from an out-of-body perspective, they say, well, you must have guessed that was going on, or you must have reconstructed this after the fact from things you'd heard, but it couldn't possibly have happened while you were unconscious. Well, those things just don't happen.
Yeah.
And yet we have lots of examples where it actually does happen. And people see very unexpected things that they couldn't have possibly guessed.
So when the body dies and there's no brain activity and, no pulse, is that, I mean, do we know enough about the brain to say there's nothing going on there that we're just not measuring yet? I mean, it's because I know you discuss how these people are having these vivid, insanely real experiences. And yet there's very little, when you can tell, brain activity when the scan's been done. Now, is that pretty solid in that opinion, or is there a chance that there's something going on there that we just can't measure yet?
Well, we don't know enough of the brain to say that it's solid. It appears that brain death occurs over a period of time. There's not just one event where you can say, oh, they were alive, now they're dead. Mm-hmm. It's a process, and it takes time. It may take minutes, it may take hours for the whole brain to die. What we do know, though, is that the cerebral cortex, the huge part of the brain that is on the outside, which is under normal circumstances, the source of all our thoughts and perceptions and so forth, and of complex thinking, that we can measure with an EEG, with measuring brain waves. And that clearly is absent in some people who have very vivid near-death experiences. Now, you can argue that perhaps when that cortex goes down, other parts of the brain may step up and take on those functions. Maybe the deeper part of the brainstem or the cerebellum, or maybe even nerves that are elsewhere in the body. You have huge nerve complexes in the abdomen, around the gut. Maybe they can somehow take on some of these functions of the now dead cerebral cortex. We have no evidence that can happen, but that is plausible and might happen, we could say.
Yeah, you would think. What's odd to me is like when you talk about if the body was producing some sort of reaction like that, why would it be, you know what I mean? Like from just an evolutionary point of view, like what benefit that you have a nice time when you die, does that have anything to do with survival? So, I mean, is that kind of how you come down? I mean, you got to see, I mean, just based on everything else that we do, our appearance from behavior, you can kind of tie it back to a survival mechanism or something.
Right.
Whereas I don't see any reason why you'd have to have a blissful experience on your way out. And more oddly enough, it's uniform around the world.
Well, actually, people have speculated about the evolutionary value of a near-death experience. In most cases, that people become very calm, very quiet, very peaceful. And if you're in a crisis situation, maybe that will help you survive.
True.
To remain calm rather than using up all your energy trying to fight something. It also leaves you with less of a fear of dying than you had before. And that can be helpful in future circumstances.
That's a good point.
And even if it doesn't help you, just your family and your clan seeing that you are dying very peacefully may help them. So, there may be some evolutionary value to having a near-death experience.
That's true. That's a good point. I didn't think of that. I guess how many people have NDEs?
Well, most studies that have tried to estimate this find that about 5% of the population have near-death experiences. That's 1 out of every 20 people. So someone in your family, someone in your classroom, at your workplace has probably had a near-death experience. And of course, those are the ones that are willing to tell us about it. There may be more who we don't know about.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that a lot of people, I guess more people would want to tell versus don't? I mean, I guess you have no way of knowing how many are keeping it hidden, but from the examples kind of I mean, some people are very eager to talk about it.
Yes, some are now, but we've been doing these studies since the 1970s. And back in those days, 70s and 80s, people were very reluctant to share these. They would be called crazy, they would be labeled, they would be ridiculed. And it was very hard to get people to talk about these experiences. You had to earn their trust. Often took months to do that. Now we've had so much publicity about near-death experiences, and there's been so much awareness that these are normal experiences that happen to people under abnormal conditions, that people are less afraid of speaking about their NDEs. But there is still a lot of resistance, and some people just feel that it's too sacred an experience, it's too personal, and I don't want to share it with other people.
Now, is there a difference between like a religious experience and an atheist? Or I know you talk about how someone can have a different religious background and kind of project that on there.
Right.
And this is a question, it's totally speculative because who knows? But I mean, from all your research, you've seen so many cases and seen so many trends. Is it more believable, I guess, to say that they're projecting their beliefs, or that whatever that is giving them a sense of comfort to not be afraid? Because I've seen that kind of mentioned too by people who've had these things. I know there's really no way of knowing, but have you seen kind of maybe more so take that point of view versus not?
Well, we have lots of examples of people who are atheists who have no belief in a deity or in an afterlife, who have the same type of profound near-death experience as everyone else does. And they are quite startled to find themselves apparently surviving after their bodies have died. And furthermore, when we look at cross-cultural studies of near-death experiences across the globe, and in fact, going back to the ancient world, the phenomena people report are the same all over the world. But most near-death experiences say that what happened to me can't be put into words. And then we researchers say, great, tell me all about it. So we know we're making them distort the experience by telling us. Yeah. And they usually resort to metaphors. And the metaphors they have are usually religious or cultural.
Oh, okay.
So many people will talk about seeing this warm, loving being of light that welcomes them into this other realm. And people here in the US will often say that was God. But then they will also say, it wasn't the God that I was taught about in church. I just don't know what else to call it, so you'll understand what I'm talking about. But it's much bigger than anything I was taught about before. And we hear the same reports of this loving being of light from other cultures that are Christian, that don't have a concept of a God, and they don't use that word, but they describe the same phenomenon.
Now, can you boil it down to stages of an NDE that happen kind of more than not, regardless of what someone's kind of religious bent is and what they're trying to tell you after the fact? Like you have I know you mentioned in the book, the tunnel wasn't necessarily something that you could rely on because it happened in other cases, but the entity of light, a life review, are there certain things that are happening pretty much in every single case, just kind of under a different context, depending on their belief?
Yeah, there's nothing that happens in every single near-death experience. You know, if a bunch of your friends took a flight to Paris, they wouldn't have the identical experience. They each have their own interpretation of it. But the most common thing is a sense of overwhelming peace and well-being in the near-death experience. And remember, this is in the context of being close to death, which is usually painful and frightening. And they suddenly get overwhelmed by this sense of peace and pleasantness. Beyond that, people often report leaving the physical body, having a review of their entire lives, encountering some other entity or entities that they may interpret as being deities or deceased loved ones, and going to some other apparently non-physical realm. And then at some point, they're either told to come back for various reasons, or they choose to come back and find themselves back in the body again.
Well, one of the ones that really struck me was, and kind of going into like whether or not it's something that's, produced in the mind or not, was, and correct me if I misunderstood when I read this, is when the individual who had, I think he took hallucinogens and there were like dwarves all around his feet and kind of up and around him. But then when he had the near-death experience, he was outside of his body and he could see that there were no doors there.
Right.
And that to me was amazing because that's showing you kind of an objective truth now that he's bounced out. And that now he's kind of confirming like there is some separation there between the brain and the mind for that instance.
Well, there is. And in that particular case, yes, the person had taken an overdose, was hallucinating, and then left his body and looked down and saw his body looking around in confusion. But where he was up above, he couldn't see these little figures around him. Mm-hmm. So he knew that his body was hallucinating, but he was not. However, if you're talking about evidence, all we have is his statement that this is what happened to him. We have no objective way of measuring that. But we do have some things where we do have objective evidence of it. And an example is, many people will report that they encounter deceased loved ones in their near-death experience. And that's easy to dismiss as wishful thinking and imagination. Mm-hmm. You think you're dying, you want to be greeted by your deceased parents or something. But there are a number of cases where people encounter a deceased individual that they didn't know had died. And you can't dismiss this as expectation or wishful thinking because you didn't know that they were dead. Mm-hmm. Let me get one example I had. It was a fellow who was 25 years old, and he had severe pneumonia, and he was having repeated respiratory arrest where he couldn't breathe, and he was in the hospital. Actually, this is back in the 70s. He was in an iron lung, actually. And he had one nurse that worked with him every day who was about his age, and they got to be fairly friendly. And one day she told him she was going to be taking a long weekend off, and there'd be other nurses substituting for her. So she went off, and while she was gone for the weekend, he had another respiratory arrest, had to be resuscitated. And during that period, he had a vivid near-death experience. And he found himself in a beautiful pastoral scene. And there, to his surprise, this nurse comes walking towards him, the one that had taken the weekend off. And he did a double take and said, "Anita, what are you doing here?" And she said, I want you to go back you can't stay here. You need to go back, and I want you to find my parents and tell them that I'm sorry that I wrecked the red MGB, and that you turned and walked away. When he then woke up back in his body in the ICU, he tried to tell this to the first nurse that walked into the room. She got very upset and rushed out. It turned out that his favorite nurse had taken the weekend off to celebrate her 21st birthday, and her parents surprised her with a gift of a red MGB, which he got in, took a drive, crashed into a telephone pole, and died shortly before his near-death experience. Now, how do you explain that in terms of his brain hallucinating?
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, how many of those do you have? Are those kind of rare because of the problem it is to kind of track down people and confirm things, or is this kind of a common occurrence to where you can confirm some of these events?
Well, it's hard to find the evidence to confirm it. About a decade ago, I published a paper that had about 30 of these cases. We have some cases going back to the ancient world. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder wrote about a case in the 1st century. That's the same type of thing where someone was presumed dead, had a near-death experience, and saw his brother dead. And his brother, as far as anyone knew, was still alive. He then revived and talked about seeing his brother and mentioned some things like where his brother had hidden the gold for him. And it turned out that he was right.
That's crazy.
We can't go back now 2,000 years corroborating testimony, but
Yeah. No, that's pretty incredible. And I think those are the cases for me that kind of make me stop and go, there's something there, because it only takes one of those to be correct for there to be something worth studying. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And we have many.
Yeah. More than one.
Yeah. We have lots of people who leave their bodies during an operation, for example, and describe things that was going on in the operating room that they couldn't possibly have known, very unexpected things they couldn't possibly have guessed. The frustration for us is that we can't duplicate this in a controlled situation. These are just sort of anecdotes, even though they're corroboratable, they're just anecdotes. We've tried to place hidden targets in rooms where people are likely to have cardiac arrest in the hospital and see if people can report these targets when they leave their bodies. And we have not found any yet. When I tell this kind of experiment to near-death experiencers, they just kind of laugh at me. They say, if you're out of your body for the first time in your life, why are you going to look around for some target you didn't know was there? and then try to remember it for the researcher.
Yeah. I saw this great tie-dye butterfly up in the corner, guys. Thanks for putting it there. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't make much sense. And that's the problem. I think it always comes back to the anecdote, huh?
Right.
Now, I wanted to touch on this because I know Dr. Eben Alexander mentioned it and you touched on it in the book, but having kind of negative NDEs or scary ones or ones that you believe you're in hell, and you mentioned that it can come from people who lived good lives, bad lives, that didn't really necessarily coincide with you being an evil person. Right. I think Dr. Alexander's belief was it was just people kind of misunderstanding or being afraid of the experience at first. And then I think you note too, a lot of these people came around later and actually had comfort and peace. Yeah. So are there any ones where I guess their life changes regardless, but do you give more credence to, it's probably a misunderstanding or fear of death? Or do you think that there is an actual element there? Not saying there's like a hell that they're going to, but where they're getting objective, if that's true, and the mind separate, objective negative feedback from whatever that is.
Right. Well, of course, I don't know if there's a heaven and hell. People who describe these things to me usually say, I'm going to call it heaven because that's the closest word I can have for it, but it wasn't, pearly gates and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But about between 1% and 5% of near-death experiences are unpleasant. Okay. And the people that I've known well who have had that type of experience tend to be people who need to be in control of their lives, who have a very strong desire to be in an organized, controlled environment. And when they find themselves in the NDE, of course, they're out of control. Mm-hmm. They're not in control of what's happening. And that's terrifying for them. And they try to fight it. And some of them will eventually get exhausted trying to fight it and just surrender. And then it becomes blissful like all the others. Okay. So we can speculate that what's unpleasant about these experiences is the resistance to it, the fighting it. Now, I don't know if that's true. We don't have enough of these cases to really do some rigorous studies with them. But I suspect that's a large part of what's going on with this.
Okay. I think I got this stat right. You said of the people who die and are resuscitated, 20% of those have an NDE. Is that accurate?
Right.
Now, I guess what does it say about everyone who doesn't, right? Because if, I know you mentioned there's drugs involved in a lot of these cases that can help mess up your memory, so you're not really aware of what's going on after the fact, even though maybe you did have an experience. I mean, does it say anything for or against, you think, the evidence when I guess the majority aren't having these things?
I don't really know what it means. We've looked at all sorts of physiological details of the near-death event, trying to see if we can find what makes some people remember things and other people don't. Mm-hmm. And we just don't have the answer to it. For example, people said that a lack of oxygen is what causes a near-death experience. And when you look at the data, people who have near-death experiences actually have better oxygen flow to the brain than people who don't have NDEs in that situation. Mm-hmm. And that may suggest that you need a fairly intact brain with oxygen going to it to be able to remember the experience later on.
Interesting.
So, I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's one hypothesis. But certainly things we've looked at, either psychological makeup or physical events of the near-death experience, or how they live their lives, don't seem to correlate with whether they have a near-death experience or not. Now, one of my colleagues who happens to be deeply religious suggested to me that maybe God decides only 20% of these people deserve to have an afterlife. And, mm-hmm. I can't argue with that. That's beyond my scientific expertise.
Yeah.
I doubt that's the truth, but
yeah. If you're believing that it's a severing of that connection between brain and mind, well, who knows when that happens, under what conditions that happens. Right. You know what I mean? It's like, that seems like such a difficult thing to research. Were you ever frustrated through this, going like, man, I just can't?
Every day.
Did you, I don't know, was it kind of just a redoubling of your efforts into like, there's got to be a way I can objectively kind of research this? Or have you had to kind of go, I'm just not going to know. We're not going to know.
Well, yeah, I do accept that we aren't going to know in my lifetime, but I think it's a very important question to ask. The relationship between mind and body, mind and brain is very, very important for our understanding of who we are as human beings. Mm-hmm. So I think it's worth pursuing things like near-death experiences. And there are others as well, experiences that we can't understand according to our current models of neurophysiology. Mm-hmm. I think we need to try to understand those in order to get a handle on what's going on with mind and brain. It may take another 100 years, but I think we need to keep doing it.
It sure makes it easier. If you believe or you buy into the mind is separate from the brain, it sure makes a lot of these things a lot easier to explain. It goes, oh, that makes sense now.
Well, it does, but we still can't explain how the mind and the brain interact.
Yeah, there's nothing you can measure inside the brain that would show, okay, well, it's kind of maybe channeling through this area, or this is acting like an antenna or something.
Although we're looking. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the reducing valve, and that was the model they had back in the days of the steam engines back in the late 1800s. Aldous Huxley wrote about that. And now people often talk about a filter or a transducer. So for example, a television set doesn't create the show. The show is created somewhere else, and it's beamed through the airwaves, and the television set picks up those signals and translate them into a picture and sound that you can see and hear. Mm-hmm. Without that, you can't understand it. And the idea is that the brain does this for us. Our bodies can't understand the thoughts in the mind. It needs the brain to translate them to us so we can understand them. So the brain is sort of a filter, just like a television set filters out all the channels you don't want to watch right now and just lets one in. Mm-hmm. The brain filters out all the irrelevant stuff in the mind and just lets in the important stuff. So what's important? Well, the brain evolved as a physical organ to help us survive in the physical world. So the stuff that's important for the brain to let in are things that help us survive. They help us find food and shelter and a mate and so forth. You don't need to communicate with deceased loved ones to do that, or with God. You need to find out what's going on. So it filters out all that irrelevant stuff. And it's only when that filter is knocked out, like in a near-death situation, mm-hmm. that these other thoughts come in. This should not be surprising because we know that our eyes and our ears filter out a lot of the stimulation and just let in a small range of the electromagnetic spectrum or frequencies of sound. We don't hear all of it. We just hear a small amount. That's important for us to survive with.
Exactly. And you hear so much about dimensions and like whether or not there's things that we just don't perceive.
Right.
And there's more and more of that research coming out. And I won't pretend to know, about quantum mechanics and all those crazy things where particles are interacting with other particles like across distances. I feel like there's so much there that would maybe start giving some kind of legs to just the anecdotes that you can't necessarily explain. What's the longest someone has been dead and come back with an NDE? Are you aware of that at all?
I know of someone who was in a freezer in the morgue for 3 days.
What?
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. He was actually a physicist. It was actually back in Soviet days in the USSR. And he was a dissident, and he was actually run down by a car. He thinks it was intentional. And he was declared dead and was put in the morgue. And then they took him out 3 days later to embalm him, and he started moving his finger, and then they started becoming alert again. And he woke up with a very vivid near-death experience in his memory. He then managed to escape and came to the U.S., where he became a preacher. So he, gave up his career as a physicist and started talking about this spiritual experiences he had.
Jeez. 3 days, you would think there's not much going on in the brain at that point, right?
Well, in the brain, that's true. But obviously a lot was going on with him.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the reducing valve thing and alluded to that and kind of what we perceive. And I think that reminded me of the DMT and other drugs. And people take those, feel like that kind of opens up the door, and now they're able to see a whole nother part of reality. I know you mentioned that in your book a little bit. Is that something that you find as supportive, I guess, of kind of the reducing valve theory?
Well, we're just on the ground level of research into this field. We used to assume that hallucinogenic drugs, psychedelic drugs, stimulate the brain to hallucinate. Mm-hmm. But in the last 10 or 15 years, there have been some good studies of neuroimaging of people during these psychedelic drug trips at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore and at Imperial College in London. And they've documented that the more elaborate mystical experiences with drugs are associated with a decrease in brain activity.
Crazy.
Which sort of contradicts the idea that these are hallucinations.
Mm-hmm.
And it does support the idea that the less the brain is involved, the more you have freedom to access this spiritual realm.
Mm-hmm. And then is it just a couple that kind of are viewed that way? Is it DMT? And I think was it ketamine? Are those the same or?
No, they're different. And they've done studies with LSD and with psilocybin as well.
Okay. Yeah, I know psilocybin is something I've heard a lot about.
Yeah.
Have you ever personally done any of those things?
Not that I can talk about.
Okay. Because you always hear, I've never actually spoken to anyone with that experience, but from what, is it different than an NDE? Like if you die and you kind of see the being of light and all this stuff? Because I feel like some of the DMT reports tend to be more abstract. Maybe that's not a good word.
Well, yeah. You can certainly get most of the things in a near-death experience with these drugs. But you also get a lot of other stuff with these drugs that you don't get in a near-death experience. More bizarre hallucinations that are more idiosyncratic. With a near-death experience, you get pretty much the same thing that almost everyone else gets in a near-death experience. And you don't get that consistency with the psychedelics. But there is increasing research now going on with the after effects of trips, especially with psilocybin, which is one of the easier ones to use in a controlled setting. It's got a shorter duration of action than, say, LSD. Mm-hmm. And they're finding at Hopkins that after just one trip with psilocybin, you can have profound changes in spirituality and in decreased fear of death for up to a year after the experience.
Like I know, I was following a lot of research with that, and it seems like, did they put a hold on some of that for a while because of like the drug classifications?
Yes.
So kind of maybe. Go ahead.
There was a lot of research done back in the 60s and early 70s, and it was really clamped down because the drugs were being abused. And it's only been in the last decade, really, that they've been opening up permission to use these drugs again.
That would be interesting if that ended up being kind of an avenue to research NDEs and that kind of phenomenon a little bit more instead of, shutting it down.
Yeah, it would. I'm not sure it's going to work out.
Yeah.
I've talked to a number of people who have had both near-death experiences and drug experiences, and they say they're not the same. It's like watching a movie about war and actually being in battle. Mm-hmm. You may use the same words to describe what you're seeing and hearing, but it doesn't feel the same. It's not the same experience at all.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then I won't hold my breath for that. I guess shifting to medicine and kind of the acceptance of it, and I know we kind of discussed it briefly earlier, is like, what do you think it'll take for the scientific community as a whole to start taking this, I guess, more serious? Is there going to need to be a discovery that kind of opens it up more, or is it going to be on the fringes until that point? Or what do you think is the biggest roadblock for other people to kind of buy into this?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest roadblock is our materialistic mindset that is so rigid. Max Planck said that science makes progress funeral by funeral. I think I see that in medicine as well, that, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, when we started doing this research, no one had heard about these things. Mm-hmm. And people were very, very skeptical if these things even existed. And now doctors don't have any doubts that they do exist, that they're fairly common, and that they have profound effects on their patients. There's still a lot of legitimate skepticism about what causes them, mm-hmm. but not about the fact that they are there and they're very common. I see among my colleagues who are as old as I am, there's a lot of resistance to accepting a non-physiological explanation for these. But among the students that I'm teaching now, who are in their 20s and 30s, they're willing to accept all this. They kind of grew up with the drug culture and with having these spiritual experiences being part of their culture. I mean, even Homer Simpson's had a near-death experience now. So they're all over the place.
Yeah.
And people in the next generation are much more open to understanding these things.
That's good to hear, because you kind of think about, well, what happens when that generation who kind of pioneered it goes away, and is there another generation coming up that's going to actually support that work?
Yeah, there is. I'm delighted to hear that I have colleagues in Europe and in Australia, New Zealand, who are just recent PhD graduates who are doing this research carrying it farther than I could have taken it. They have different backgrounds than I did, either in better neurophysiological training or cross-cultural research, and they can explore parts of the NDE that I didn't have the expertise to study.
Do you think it's partly because it carries some religious connotations that people or scientists don't want to entertain it, or is it just simply the materialism that it's just, if we can't see it, measure it, we're not going to entertain it?
It's a little of both. I mean, there are still a lot of scientists who feel that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. That's the way I was taught. That's the way I grew up. But I've seen enough things that I know exist that I can't measure that I kind of don't buy into that anymore. But beyond that, there's this fear that if we open the door to these things, it'll open the floodgates to all sorts of superstitions, and we'll back in the Middle Ages. And,
yeah, I don't think anybody wants that.
Yeah.
I mean, have you received pushback from anyone? Because you have your book out and stuff. Have you received any kind of high level pushback? I know Dr. Alexander did a little bit. Have you kind of gotten any of that?
Not as much as he has by any means. I've had no pushback from my university administration. I mean, they're very pleased with it. But I have had individual colleagues who are neuroscientists who have kind of dismissed what I'm saying and saying, well, these are all anecdotes. You can't believe any of it. You're just not, you're giving up on science before we have all the answers. And I'm not giving up on science. I think science will understand this eventually. And it may be a physiological explanation. It may not. I think the evidence is pointing away from that right now, but I could be wrong. We could find out things 50 years from now that would change my mind if I were still alive.
What would it take for you to kind of abandon the separation there and look just for a kind of a materialistic? What would have to be presented to you to be like, oh, okay, well, that works as an explanation?
I don't know that there's any way you can put all this in the brain. We've seen enough cases where the brain is not quite functioning when people have these elaborate experiences. But it is possible that someday we may find that there are other physiological parts of us outside the brain that may have some role in all this. I mentioned before that there were nerve cells outside the brain, certainly outside the cortex, that potentially maybe have a role in consciousness. We haven't discovered anything that yet, but it's plausible. And there are other cells besides nerve cells that have the potential to conduct electrical activity and transmit electrical currents. So it's possible that someday we may find that there are some physiological explanations. I mentioned before dark matter. We have no idea what that is, but it's the vast majority of the matter in the universe. And for all we know, there may be parts of us that are made of dark matter that we just aren't aware of. And if that was the case, then we maybe find that our dark matter brain is still functioning when our physical brain is not. This is pure speculation. It's way out there. But who knows what's going to happen in 100 years?
Was there any particular case that really did it for you? Like, there's something here that kind of rocked my world a little bit. I mean, maybe it was the first one you experienced with the sauce in your tie, or has it been the culmination of just so many? And I imagine, you're in the thousands of cases that you've reviewed.
Yeah. Well, the first one that I mentioned, it certainly rocked my world, but I didn't take it as evidence of anything. Because, I was a green intern then. I didn't know what I was doing. I certainly didn't know about NDEs to ask questions about it. So I was never able to convince myself that it wasn't some trick someone was playing on me. And I can't use it as proof of anything. But since then, in the decades since then, I've interviewed lots of people who give very credible accounts of seeing things from outside the body while they were totally unconscious, totally anesthetized, or in a cardiac arrest. And we can corroborate from other people who were around at the time that what they said they saw is actually something that happened. And they were totally unexpected things you would never imagine doctors and nurses would be doing.
Yeah, I think that's what does it for me. I think that piece, like I think even you said, when they get into the otherworldly stuff, it's not super helpful because how are you going to confirm any of that? Right, but when they're in the rooms and they're talking about deceased loved ones who had no way of knowing, actions done in the room they had no way of knowing, that obviously is showing you something is existing outside the body, at least for that second. There's a pulmonologist, I don't know his name, but I saw him on a YouTube channel, and he was discussing near-death experiences, and he had mentioned they were trying to push him on his religious belief, but he was very matter of fact. He just said, I know consciousness survives after death. It could be an hour, could be 4 hours, and then it goes away. I don't know. But I said, I've seen enough evidence to where it exists outside the body for a short time at minimum. And I thought that was so interesting because it was to me, it felt like such an honest answer.
Yeah.
But you can see everybody, the scientists like bristle a little bit like, how could you say that,
Yeah.
And that is kind of, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of bothersome, but I think people like doing the work that you're doing. You said the younger generation coming up, maybe there will be a little more openness to it. I mean, everybody's obsessed with paranormal shows and paranormal this and that. And
Right.
So maybe that'll help influence, at least take a look at it. But I guess before we wrap it up here, I kind of wanted to get maybe some of your personal beliefs, your personal conclusions based on all the research you've done. How many cases have you done in total? Just like a ballpark, how many of you have you reviewed? Because I think it's important for people to know that you're a serious person of science, educated, and you approach this from an unbiased point of view, because they always look at like, they just buy into it. They're a religious fanatic, whatever it is.
Right. Well, I don't know the exact number. It's in the thousands, but I have a database of slightly more than 1,000 of people that I have enough information about their experience and their physiological states that I can include in my research database. Okay. So that's a little more than 1,000. And there are many more that I've talked to who I don't have enough information about to include them in that database.
So that database is something that you can confirm, like right. You've gone over things that you'll put a stamp on and say, hey, these seem legit.
Right.
Okay. Right. Go ahead.
You asked about my conclusions, and I got to say, I'm too much of a skeptic to say I have any.
Yeah.
I can tell you what I think the evidence points to.
Yeah.
I think the evidence points very strongly to the fact that we are more than just our physical bodies, that there is something non-physical about us that can function somehow with the physical body in normal everyday life. But when the physical body is impaired, it can continue to function. And the data suggests that it continues to function after our bodies die. I can't say I know that for sure. I can't even say I believe that for sure. But that's the way the evidence seems to be suggesting to me that the answer lies.
So if you had to choose at this moment, you would say consciousness survives death?
I would say it probably does.
Okay. What do you think the biggest misconception about NDEs is, maybe from the public point of view and also from the other medical establishment?
I think many people still think they are rare. As we said before, that they're not at all rare. 1 in 20 people has had one. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a wide perception that they are somehow related to mental illness, and they are not at all. We've done extensive research on mental illness and near-death experiences, and there's just no association at all between the two of them. So they happen to normal people under abnormal circumstances.
That in your book, and again, I recommend everybody pick up your copy of your book because you go into such detail and methodical, like how you approach things. But that was one of the more interesting parts, I think, was your comparison and kind of ruling out mental illness and how you compared. And that, to me, was a surprise too, because you get these general misrepresentations of NDEs and like, well, it could be just mental illness, and people throw out these excuses, even though you're very honest about what it could be. But you're also honest about it's not this. This isn't, the data doesn't point to this at all. So I really appreciated that in your book.
Thank you.
And this is, again, this is like just based off what you've seen so far, heard from other people. So do you believe an entity that we would look at as a god, some form of god exists?
I'm not sure that I go along with entity. That may be too strong a word.
Okay.
There is something larger than us that we are somehow able to relate to, and many NDEers say that we are a part of that. And they describe it like a wave in the ocean. While you're in this life, you're a wave which has a discrete structure, but is part of the same stuff that the rest of the ocean's made of. And eventually you will fade back into the rest of the ocean. And it's kind of the concept of that ocean, that larger thing, is what we call God. It's something that is pervasive, that's much larger than us, and that we are essentially a part of. And many people come back from a near-death experience saying, I now recognize not only the divine out there, but the divine in here inside me. and inside everybody else as well.
That was a really interesting point. I think Dr. Alexander mentioned that too, was that the idea of reincarnation, the idea that you are part of something larger, almost like a cell inside a body, and that we're just part of this consciousness, I guess, for lack of a better word. But that's striking because, like you said, it's like people from grow up with just I'm my God figure, the man,
right,
the man with the beard in the sky, and they come back with this completely different idea about it.
Right.
And that to me is really striking too, because when we got into the evolutionary part and everything, and is there a survival mechanism? But why would you come back with different ideas about how the structure of the universe is? You know what I mean? It's so interesting to me. Do you believe that there's somewhere darker you can go, maybe a lack of that oneness, that love? Is there a place, because people always talk about a renewed sense of living with purpose, doing good, having a life review and seeing how you affect other people? Did it seem to be that there was an acceptance afterward, or was there anything that was, you didn't figure this out correctly? Either a reincarnation, go back, was that a theme, or was a kind of a darker lack of that love for people who kind of wanted to turn away from it, maybe through the fear that you were talking about, or the control? Yeah. Was there any theme in the near-death experiences for that would lead you to believe one or the other?
Well, most people come back feeling if there's meaning and purpose in their lives and everything that we do. And this is a large part of why they are not suicidal when they come back. Most of them come back saying, death was wonderful, so why aren't they suicidal then? It's because they feel that there's a sense of meaning and purpose in being alive now. And that makes them not suicidal. They want to do what they're supposed to be doing here, and then eventually they know they're going to die sooner or later. And people who have unpleasant near-death experiences seem to have the same effects of thinking that there's meaning and purpose in everything we're doing here. And I had a bad experience, but that doesn't mean I will eventually when I die. And maybe I can do something better in my life now to make it more likely I'll have a great experience next time.
What would you be looking for in the future? Any kind of speculative guesses about what they could do to help solidify this as actually occurring? Anything on like the horizon for science that could potentially give more evidence to that, or give more objective evidence to this?
Well, we're such a early stage of this that it's hard to speculate. Mm-hmm. But we talked about a function of the brain that filters things out or lets things in, and there is some research going on now at a couple of different centers where they're trying to look at what part of the brain might be involved in this filtering process. And if we can nail that down, that may give us some tools to look at what is being filtered, how is it happening.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's exciting. And I recommend everybody go check out your book and read it. You can find, I actually listened to it on Audible. I started doing that. It's like so much nicer. It's almost like a podcast. I can just like put it on, do other stuff, and like listen. Yeah. Because I have 3 kids, and if I go to like lay down at night and open up a book, it doesn't matter if it's like the most interesting thing in the world. I'm like starting to doze off. Now, if anybody wants to know more, do you have a website, any information where they could go and kind of check out even other cases or anything like that?
Sure. My website is brucegreyson.com. It's Greyson. And there's information there about the book, about near-death experiences, about my career. Lots of information there, and references to other sources of information. There are some organizations that promote research into NDEs and have support groups for near-death experiencers. Cool.
Well, awesome, sir. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really do appreciate it. And best of luck moving forward. Are you currently doing research still, or are you?
I am.
Okay, so you're still on the forefront.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you discover the next thing that can cause you maybe another book to come out and give us some more light on the subject.
Thanks, Scott.
All right, thank you.